We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and we are talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, everyone's weird reactionary super uncle, which is in some ways I find this conversation somewhat frustrating because when we had it on Twitter, I was like, this is the exact wrong place to have it, because I have a very ambivalent stance towards Nietzsche. On one hand, I think he's a reactionary. I've argued with Shailen Van Tine about this, even that I do not think you can cast Nietzsche in a non-reactionary mode. On another hand, I don't know that bugs me as much as it bugs other people.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's an interesting point, because like there's a lot of historical things to throw out there, right? Like, because first of all, I just want to say at the outset that Nietzsche was my introduction to philosophy, arguably to the life of the mind, which I decided to commit myself to. And when I first read Nietzsche, I understood very little. And that's actually part of the point. I mean, you have to understand that if you read Stephen Ansheim's Nietzsche in Germany, the commodification of Nietzsche occurred literally like 10 years after his death. And by that, I mean, many of the texts of Nietzsche didn't require the profound scholastic attention that you would think, that a lot of academics today tell us that they require, right? That's a common refrain that you hear from scholars of Nietzsche, which is actually, I can't speak about Nietzsche's on the total because I'm only an expert in the early Nietzsche. I was at a Nietzsche conference and they actually said that, right? So you have that dynamic that academics do, which is a kind of strange, he furthers a certain ideology of hierarchy there. But at the masses level, we know that Nietzsche, was read more than Marx amongst workers. It was actually, Marx was like fifth in a survey that was done around turn of the century German workers, industrial workers. Wagner was ahead of Marx, and I think actually, but Nietzsche was number one. However, thing that's interested me so much is what is Nietzsche's function and role within a left-wing movement, within a workers' movement, and of course within Marxist theory, Marxist thought. And so, I'm writing a book on this, and I've just discovered so many interesting things, and I'm excited to kind of bring them out in this conversation. And I don't presume to take Nietzsche away from anybody or to cancel him, but rather merely invite a different reading, maybe, and to take what you're saying, the reactionary piece, and to say, okay, how can we actually learn differently than maybe we have about what the meaning of that actually is? Because there's a difference between saying Nietzsche is a reactionary along the line of a common bourgeois reactionary of his time. He supported eugenics. He said some quite racist things. So did Immanuel Kant. So did Hegel. This is a common excuse of Nietzsche. And of course, the anti-Semitism piece is one way in which people say, well, actually Nietzsche had crazy and wild ideas that were quite pro-Jewish, so we can't associate him with Nazism at all, etc., etc. So there is a tendency to push, because Nietzsche is the godfather of postmodernism, and because postmodern, and that's a true statement, even Cornel West would submit to it, because that means that indeterminate truth, undecipherability are actually elevated as privileged modes of epistemology in the Nietzschean cosmos. Therefore, his agenda can also be put off the table. But I'm not actually interested in saying, or coming to like the detective, like on the hunt. Is Nietzsche really a racist? Was he really anti-Semitic? Did he really hide his support for slavery? I'm less interested in that question. I'm less interested in that. That you could call the Luserdist approach, part of Lucerdo's approach. I think it's valuable. I think it transforms our understanding from the Walter Kaufmann post-war consumer capitalist era of reading Nietzsche, which is defanged Nietzsche. Keep in mind, when Carl Jung gave his 2 to 3 year seminar on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he said very clearly that this is toxic material. Not toxic in the way we mean it today, but like this is live wire. This is not for everybody. This needs a warning label on it. And every reader of Nietzsche in the early days recognized that. I mean, there are examples in America of Nietzschean murders, people inspired by Nietzsche's aristocratic ethos and committed murders on plebeian lower classmen. That's actually happened. There's a whole history there. Clarence Darrow was actually the lawyer in this particular case, which I'm writing about in my book. But the pre-war Nietzsche was a dangerous, subversive, aristocratic rebel, which is a term that Nietzsche was asked, does this describe your politics? And he said, yes, it does. There's no debate there. The debate comes in this post-war period for two reasons. One, the French fought the Nazis, and the intellectuals in the Vichy-occupied regime, in a parasitical way, needed to take this esoteric doctrine of Nietzscheanism and use it as a weapon against the fascist ideology. And that is why French Nietzscheanism became so creative and so fascinating and so interesting. Here I'm talking about Gilles Deleuze, Pierre Klossowski, and Georges Bataille. Fascinating stuff, right? Georges Bataille has a maxim, which is Nietzsche is the only philosopher who is outside of communism. If you meditate on that, almost like a Zen koan, you understand that Bataille honored and recognized two things. One, Nietzsche defeated communism. Let's not be. I was speaking to someone recently, and they said it's criminal to call Nietzsche a world historical philosopher compared to Marx. Marx shaped history. Marx shaped ideas. Yes, he did, but so did Nietzsche. And this is what the neoconservatives get right about Nietzsche, like Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss says, and Alan Bloom, one of his disciples who wrote The Closing of the American Mind during the culture war period in the 90s, right? He said, the left, Leo Strauss says this in his lectures on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the left doesn't understand, the American left he's talking about in particular, doesn't understand that when they have a deficiency with Marx, they turn to Nietzsche. But he points out that there's a strange unacknowledgement on behalf of the left of his esoteric elitism. He says the left disavows that. And Alan Bloom says the same thing, in which he elaborates in Closing the American Mind. So here's my position. Let's take Strauss's advice, obviously not all of his advice, but this specific point, and let us be a little bit more honest about how the elitist, how the emphasis on rank order, how the emphasis on romantic anti-capitalism functions, how it appears within the left. For example, when Deleuze wrote his famous nomadic rebel theory, he argued that Nietzsche is more important than Freud and Marx as a guiding figure of thought, because Nietzsche is the one who decodes the repressive apparatus of capitalism more thoroughly than does Marx or Freud. And he does that through the aphorism, but he also does that, Deleuze says, by becoming an enemy of his own class. And so Deleuze, as we know, is kind of swapping out the proletariat, which is bad. I mean, you can reject Deleuze right there, like, okay, no, thank you. But let's follow him through. He chooses Nietzsche because he thinks that Nietzsche can perform a more thorough bourgeois revolution, in short. My contention is that, when we invoke Nietzsche today, people don't say that. I think Deleuze kind of did say that, to his credit, which is at least honest. And then B, what that does, there's two categories there, the free spirits or the Übermensch. And the interesting thing about both of these figures of revolt is that Nietzsche concocted them as specifically to be figures that are unclassed, that transcend the class system. So in that sense, if we are Marxists who are committed to the primacy of class and committed to something like class consciousness, because you see there's a perfect coalescence between anti-phenomenological turn away from class consciousness Marxism, turn away from Lukácsian worldview Marxism, and an embrace of Nietzsche, you see? Because Nietzscheanism is actually, at the end of the day, by its very design, and I don't think this is quite debatable, not going to be a philosophy that's going to further class consciousness. And I have a bunch of things I've discovered. And I think the other thing that we need to say, and I'll stop here, I know I've been saying a lot, is that, Kaufman, he wasn't working with the whole picture of Nietzsche. It wasn't until 1977 that all of Nietzsche's material was released. And this is actually part of the reason why Losurdo's effort is so valuable, because some of that later stuff, the Nochlus and some of the journal stuff, which I just was reading this morning, is so sophisticated in its political awareness that if we don't take him seriously as a political thinker, then we lose out on a lot. And that's important, that we understand that Nietzscheanism was actually, in a sense, successful. And Sloterdijk, who I think is one of the best readers of Nietzsche working today, Peter Sloterdijk, he says the same thing. He says, look, we live in Nietzsche's world. Same thing that Strauss said, same thing that Alan Bloom said. The great hermeneutics of suspicion, Nietzsche basically was victorious. Because Nietzsche was trying to create a new man, a philosophy for the future, which has a mythical component and so on and so forth. It's a kind of hyper-individualist philosophy at the end of the day, in a certain sense. We have to honor its success. And I think that that's my feeling. So,
but one of the things I'm taken by in this is, we got into the weeds about my particular opinions about Dominic Losurdo,
right?
Which is frustrating, because that was a book that I liked half of, and the other half of, I'm like, there is a I have a complicated view on historiography and how you prioritize notes and stuff like that. But I think that distracted from some of the agreement, and where I think I am also ambivalent about Nietzsche. And at this point, I've read more Marx than Nietzsche, but that's just because there's more Marx to read.
That's
a lot more Marx to read.
That's true. That's true.
But I've spent, the early part of my career, I learned German as as a 19 and 20-year-old only to read two people, and it was Nietzsche and Hegel. And I learned that I had to learn a lot more about German to touch Hegel. To just learning German.
Right.
And I don't know that learning German actually clarified Nietzsche, except that when I read later Nietzscheans, and I think it's interesting the ones we pointed out here, of the French schools. The French school I was taught is Deleuze, not so much Guattari. I think we can actually clear him of some of this. Foucault, to some degree Derrida, and the kind of classical French Nietzscheans, the kind of truly wild but left ones, and people like Bataille were not taught to me in grad school very much. They just weren't brought up. And what I found interesting when I discovered them kind of on my own, particularly starting with Bataille. I mean, Bataille I just kind of found because, you're a 20-year-old college student in a bookstore, you got a few extra bucks, and eroticism, sex, and death is and this crazy ass philosophy is just there in some hipster store in Athens, Georgia. You're gonna pick it up. Right. It just looks cool. I mean, I hate to say that sometimes the motivation is as simple as that, but that opened me up to the fact that even the French Nietzscheans were more complicated than I thought, and that the later post-structuralist, postmodernist ones had softened Nietzsche explicitly. Like, even in small ways. I talked to you a little bit about why did they choose this French word over this French word, which makes the German word for power that Nietzsche's using sound not physical, because it's very clear in the German that it's not some abstract capacity. It's force. And stuff like that. So those are basic points. I think more complicated points is that I came to the conclusion, beginning with reading a book, and this was not a book that, in high school, I got what everybody got when they got Nietzsche. I got given the Kaufman translations and the Kaufman biography. So that was also my first exposure. That was like the standard text from like the 70s to the 90s, basically. And when I encountered a book by the Americanist Jennifer Ratner Rosshagen,
American Nietzsche,
which it's just basically a reception history of Nietzsche in the United States, from the middle of the 19th
book, though, isn't it? I mean, it shows that prior to the public relations industry and prior to modern sophisticated communications, television, etc., amongst the kind of reading classes, the literate classes, bourgeoisie, etc., Nietzscheanism was something much different. And Lukács shows in his 1953 work, Destruction of Reason, and in essays before that, that at that time, Nietzsche was an ideological force which actually shored up bourgeois power, because Nietzscheanism as a doctrine provided a vague critique of the status quo. And of course, the reference there to Mussolini, and Leo Strauss confesses this as well, is probably the most viable connection to the rise of fascism, in the sense that Nietzscheanism, one of the things that Nietzsche did during Bismarck's time was he realized that the egalitarian movements of the suffrage movement, of the rights for all men to vote, to socialism, let's call them broad egalitarian movements, more generally the kind of the overarching residues of what came after 1848, right? Nietzsche plays a very delicate dialectical role in Bismarck's Germany in trying to offer advice. Nietzsche would constantly write letters to high dignitaries as his name was becoming popular, because of course he retired from teaching, I think at our age, actually, because he had a private inheritance, and he basically went into a kind of retreat mode. And yes, he dealt with the headaches and the sickness and so on, but he really was living a life of a kind of aristocratic subtraction from labor entirely, which is why One of Nietzsche's motifs, and if you study his political writings, which appear throughout all of his work in different aphorisms, is the creation of a utopian vision of society. And he says what that utopian vision would be: a social order in which, quote, the hard work and misery of life will be allotted to the man who suffers least from it, that is, to the dullest man, and so on, step by step upwards to the man who is most sensitive to the highest, most sublimated kind of suffering, and therefore suffers even when life is most greatly eased. So you see, he's creating a rationale for bourgeois subtraction from wage labor, and he's creating also his concepts, most importantly being perspectivism, also from that perspective of the standpoint of that figure, and that he calls Übermensch. Now, Übermensch, according to Sloterdijk and other readers of Nietzsche, can also be thought of as emerging within the conditions of capitalist competition. That's like a debate in Nietzscheanism. And it's a debate about, well, would a communist society produce this? Is Übermensch a collective theory of liberation, right? And my conclusion, upon really immersing myself in Nietzsche in like a religious way, going back to him in these last few years, is that it remains connected to a romantic anti-capitalism that would be a kind of because one of the things that it allows, and he insists on over and over and over, and he gives advice to rulers towards this end, because again, Losurdo says totus politicus. Nietzsche's concepts must be understood as totus politicus, driven fundamentally by politics. What does he say? He says it is better for in a Machiavellian sense, there's a wonderful set of literature by Don Dombowski on Nietzsche and Machiavelli, which says, look, culture war is good because it doesn't politicize the masses. And the whole thing that Nietzsche realized was that socialists, and this I think is a debate that we've had before as well, Derick, which is what kind of socialist did Nietzsche critique? And here I think the answer is all kinds. In the sense that why? Because at the core, he was concerned with a society accelerating decadence. Decadence is already occurring. Nietzsche actually is not interested in accelerating that. He's actually interested in creating conditions where high art and culture can be produced, where that is circumvented, which is why Nietzsche in his middle period is a huge advocate of austerity. Austerity for bourgeoisie in particular, so that they can rein in and set an example to workers about how to be more frugal and not to desire more than is of their rank. And the other thing there about perspectivism is that he makes a movement from the emphasis on, which Deleuze picks up on as well, of the necessity of a society based on what he calls the pathos of distance. It's an extremely central idea to perspectivism, which is the Übermensch must possess their greatness by virtue of being able to perceive from multiple standpoints. Now, that at face value is a valuable contribution, and you can see its contribution to postmodern philosophy and so on. Decentered truth, a subjective truth, etc. However, one of the things we have realized in looking at commentators from a Marxist perspective is that that movement of pathos of distance is not grounded in the material rootedness or relatedness that the subject has to the mode of production at all. It's actually a contemplative movement that is privileged to the position of Übermensch. And that concerned me because what Nietzsche then says about those subjects who cannot enter into this kind of perspectival flexibility and so on is that they suffer at a different level. They are literally lower than, and therefore a society needs to be created and concocted in which their desires for advancing their condition, etc., are kept at bay. And that, I think, as a socialist, is the last thing I want to do for the working class. I think that the working class needs to be much more uneasy and content with challenging the status quo as it exists now, because we have a power that the people that rule our institutions don't have, based on the experiences that we've gone through. And Nietzscheanism bothers me because it does not want to center that. And I think that socialist philosophy must do so. So I think you're catching where I'm coming from, because I was reading this book at the recommendation of a friend of mine, which is an ethnography of the working class in America today by Jennifer Silva. And at the end of the book, she said something that really struck me. This goes back to the Straussian proposal that Nietzsche won, which is the majority of the people she interviewed, when asked, how do you negotiate the people that are more successful than you? How do you cogitate with that? How do you deal with that? And the answer that she got most often was that they must possess an inner power drive that's greater than me. And I accept that. Like, hands up. And for me, this is an example of maybe you can use Nietzsche against him. But look, we know his intentions. He would look at that and say, that's exactly how it should be. For me, and I would assume you may agree with me, that is the last thing that the working class subject should be doing. Right. Yeah. In my view, right?
Right. I mean, to me, it sounds like the Warner Sombart thesis, the common cliches. It's always pretends that this is just an American problem, that the working class, thinks it's a millionaire. And I'm always like, that's true of the working class without agitation everywhere on the planet. It's actually a pretty significant. I actually hate the fact that I don't have anything other than theological terms to turn you here, but it's a pretty different theodical reason why people would, accept, certain people climbing above. And as a person, one of the things you and I share, and I'm always hesitant to personalize things. I've become more careful and okay with it lately. Is that we're both from non-elite classes. To put it like, I'm working class and basically lumpen, and my mother became a nurse but was mostly a waitress. I know that you come from like
working poor backgrounds.
Working poor, a mixture of like working class and very poor petit bourgeoisie. And correct. And I think what's interesting about that is Nietzsche both appeals and repels me for that reason. What appeals to me about it is the transvaluation of values, the basic shit that you get actually from existentialism, like that you can raise yourself up, that you can struggle. What repulses me about it didn't become obvious to me until I started reading not the works you always get referred to, not even the genealogy of morals, or even the late problematic works in Will to Power, the ones edited by his sister. It was his classical work where I realized what was actually really kind of going on. And I've always been interested in this aristocratic element of Nietzsche because it's not biographical for him either. I mean, he's the son of a Lutheran pastor, and so not from like the working classes by any stretch of the imagination, but he also is not truly aristocracy.
True. True. Yeah, he's definitely comfortable bourgeoisie. Yeah. And that's the other thing that bothers me is that like there's a way in which the Marxist reading of Nietzsche could be disingenuous and could be used like Jack London used it. Let's just take Jack London as a quick case study.
Okay.
A lot of what London did, I really love and admire. What London basically did was he tried, the point I just made with Jennifer Silva and that kind of thing. He tried to literally flip that on its head and say, look, you need to harness the degradation that has been structurally imposed upon you and garner the power and reverse it from its Nietzschean bourgeois intentions to keep everything static as they are. He was a Bolshevik Nietzschean in that sense. Okay. Now, Bolshevik Nietzscheanism is a whole thing. I may even write a chapter on it because that became quasi-religious, okay? Because they took the necessity for invention of transvaluation of values into mythological dimension. And that's part of what Lenin was debating in imperial criticism. So, but my question is always this. Could something like London's Nietzscheanism, let's call it reverse Marxist Nietzscheanism, be done? Now, we have an example of that in Huey Newton. Huey Newton's autobiography was trying to do the same thing that Jack London was doing, in a way. Reverse Nietzsche for basically collective liberation ends. And when I taught in prison, I learned that the number one book that prisoners read, especially men, especially black men, is Robert Greene's The 50 Rules of Power. And that is a Nietzschean analysis. Inequality is natural. Power relations, it's a vulgar social Darwinism, right? I mean, it's not Nietzschean because it doesn't have any of the spiritual stuff, but I would argue that it has the imprint in the Straussian way that like Nietzsche is this kind of cultural imprint that we all live with, right? I'm not afraid to make that claim. Jeff Waite, a great Marxist critic of Nietzsche, makes the same claim. Let's honor his victory. And look, what that means is something. It means that we intuitively look at hierarchy. We intuitively look at the way capitalism works, and we naturalize it. That, to me, is like, Marx wrote about this as well, that's the kind of spontaneous ideology of the proletariat. To me, that's where Marx and Nietzsche bash heads, because we cannot accept that kind of ideological position of a kind of naturalized, set of forces that's kind of depersonalized and amor fati, in a very vulgar sense. If you read the early attraction that the working class had to Nietzsche, it was around amor fati. But think about it for a second. If the embrace of amor fati, love of my fate, what is that actually functioning to do, right? And people have written about this, actually. Like, it actually is, that's the beauty of Nietzsche, which is, yes, rank, status, rank, order, hierarchy, enforced naturalized brutality. Why do you read Nietzsche and you go from poetic beauty, sublime, into you must be prepared to exert brutality and cruelty at a moment's notice? It's like, whoa, brother, why did you make that pivot, right? Like, what is this about? But that's the beauty of Nietzsche. He brings both together, right? Mm-hmm. That's not the beauty of Nietzsche. That's the, the sublime terror of Nietzsche, right? It's what Jeff Waite calls the success of his esotericism, where it becomes a kind of, it imbues you, and it becomes a kind of a life philosophy. And that's the other reason that people are drawn to Nietzsche, is that there's nothing about this that is academic philosophy. I mean, you can turn him into an academic philosopher. It's kind of boring, but in reality, it's life ethic philosophy. And
it's real hard to turn him into a systemic academic philosopher. People have tried.
People do it. I mean,
I know they do it. But I remember reading it in college and going, yeah, no, this guy's not Hegel. Like I just read literally 600 pages of this shit in a couple of weeks in 2 languages, and I don't see the system that you're seeing at all. And I also feel like, I mean, there are texts that people overemphasize. what Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense is the one I think it's very, because it's not even a finished paper, but it is in some ways I think you have to take Nietzsche at his word. Like he's not systemic.
Well, no, I mean that's true, but also Nietzsche invents a wager, a proposition that his thought will exist, I think, for 2,000 years to come.
Right.
Walter Benjamin said that the eternal return of the same is the first modern religion of capitalism, which is a beautiful phrase, which means that it goes back to this thesis I'm trying to repeat, which is Nietzscheanism is a kind of is the most successful example of the cultural influence that philosophy can have, right? Like there's been no other philosopher who has maybe shaped our world more than him in a certain sense, right? And I was just having somebody on my program, Jan Rehmann, who's German and translated Lo Cerdo's book from Italian to German. And gosh, and you know, the whole debate on Nietzsche and the Third Reich is so deep and is so complex, you know. But look, there is a effort today to combine Marx and Nietzsche, and one of the interesting things about that effort is that it's happening on the margins of academia. Speaking of academia, in my conversations, with academics, you know what they tell me? They say academics now in philosophy departments are moving away from doing dissertations and studies of like single philosophers. They're more like issue oriented, which probably has to do with their funding streams and stuff like that. But what's interesting about that is that, okay, that means that Nietzsche is for us. Like it's up to us, like socialist movement thinkers, right, to work out where he sits with us today, because he's still read, he still is absorbed. There is still a thing as Nietzscheanism. The industry looks much different than it has historically. But nonetheless, like the prospect of how one goes about combining Marx and Nietzsche is important. It's very important. And the fact that it's fallen on us is also good, I think.
I mean, one of the things that I mean, we can be a little bit more specific here, but one of the things I think is interesting about this turn is Nietzsche academia seems to kind of stalled out a little bit, and in the mid-aughts, I think a lot of that had to do with a kind of exhaustion with postmodernism, in so much as there even is a postmodernism. A lot of that had to do with the anti-Nietzsche turn. I kind of think Malcolm Turnbull is the beginning of that. I will admit I'm not impressed with that book in particular. And not actually the Nietzsche stuff is not my main problem with it. I think some of what he says about Nietzsche's like classical influences and the aristocratic, I think that's obvious. His answers to the problems of aesthetics are kind of, in my mind, the worst impulses of Gramsci. But
there is one thing that I really like in that text, but please continue your
I'll let you get to it in a second. But I think if you offered that to working class people as an alternative to Nietzsche, if they encountered it, they'd laugh at you. And the one thing I would say, Nietzsche is probably the only modern philosopher that I know that is regularly read by non-formally educated people. And exactly. And you know, I read him off of a friend's whim in 10th grade from a public library. Like someone gave me Genealogy of Morals, and I actually think they probably picked it up from Ayn Rand critiquing him. But these are the philosophers that you encounter in the Deep South that seem edgy because they're not Christian, and you can get access to and not understand. I mean, like, I'm not claiming that most people understand Nietzsche when we encounter him at 15, and I know it's kind of a joke that that people do and it ruins their lives or whatever. But I'm also like, but you have to admit then that you're saying that Nietzsche is the one philosopher of the important ones that we listen, of the like 3 to 4 horsemen of modernity.
Right.
He's the one that people actually read.
Correct.
Before they're formally educated and not assigned to.
Right.
Like,
right. Because he was writing these weird spiritual political pamphlets. Like they're not even, they're kind of somewhere between a book of poems and a manifesto. Like, what is this? What is your style, bro? Like your style is like crazy. You're manic depressive. You're all over the place. You're apparently a philologist who's this important for those reasons, which we don't know anything about, but that's fine. That's your authority. And now you're giving me this kind of like souped up self-help. And that's no surprise. One of the influences that Nietzsche had on young people in Germany after he died was he's part of the reason why they started the backpacking movement, going off into the woods and backpacking. So, you know, Nietzsche gets you moving. Nietzsche is not an idle thinker. So I have respect for all of that. But again, I want to bring him into different terms, okay? On the genealogy of morals. If we accept Lukács's and Lucerdo's framing of that text, his first major text, as a response to the Paris Commune, the first movement that socialists and anarchists took state power, that means something different. That means that, wow, this guy is actually an antagonist to the very goals I want to enact today. And then you look at the trajectory of all of his other work, which also tend to have political responses. He's driven by political interests. And the fact also that the neoconservative movement, after the success of McCarthyism, basically embraced a lot of the Nietzschean cosmos. Nietzschean cosmos of ideology justifies rank order, right? The whole point was to allow for a type of Chandala class that would be happy enough in its toil not to create all of this turbulence and nihilism. Like if nihilism is a result of worker agitation, that means as a Marxist, we can learn something from that. That may not be true in the way that he's framing it, but it shows that he's right, that the power of the working class possesses that, right? That itself is a powerful insight to me, that is worth understanding and taking his politics like quite seriously. The other thing we learned, though, of course, is that Nietzsche became a philosopher of the discontent of repressed youth in 1968 and in both America and in Europe. And that's very interesting, which is that Nietzsche's read in prisons. He's read by the Panthers. He's read by the Bolsheviks. He's read by everybody. But one of the things where his political insight emerges the most is in youth revolts. And we were just talking about how today, like, everything is kind of student and there's this issue of adolescence and youthful stuff. Nietzsche appears there. He offers something there. There's an attachment thing there. And my argument is that, it's kind of a crazy argument maybe, is that because his philosophy is so explosive and revolutionary, which it is, he's forcing us to face, when we are engaged in a social order that's undergoing a profound change, etc., he's forcing us to face a decision about what kind of social order will be created as we move. And one of the big debates that early socialists like Franz Mehring and other German SPD thinkers noticed is that the young people reading Nietzsche during revolutionary times had a tendency to abandon their commitment to collective worker liberation. And I think when we assess things like Deleuze and Guattari, fervent Nietzscheans at the core, we see something similar, right? Like the errors of 68 student stuff. So what I'm trying to say is Yes, Nietzsche can be a philosopher of working class. We have a little bit of history of that. Most of it's not good, but most of the time he's a philosopher for student revolt. And that's another reason why Marxists should be cautious about how he's being incorporated in popular revolt.
Yeah, I think, you know, most people don't know about this about me. I am a critical scholar in English, a critical scholar in the loosest sense of that term of early Maoism. And one of the things that I've learned from reading a lot of the Russian biographies of Mao that I can find translated, and a particularly good one is Mao: The Real Story, which is a pretty sympathetic biography based mostly off of Soviet archival material by Alexander Pantsov, and I think was originally released in Russian, is that one of the weirder things about Mao and Maoism is during his student phase, before he discovered Kropotkin and the Russian anarchist, he comes to Marx actually somewhat late. I mean, he's actually like an active Marxist before he's even read Marx. But his first exposure is largely to a kind of sinified version of liberal Nietzscheanism in the 1920s. I bring that up because I don't think it's like I tend to distrust totally ideologically genealogical views of figures like Mao or of political movements. But I do think it's interesting because I think there's some ambivalence, the ambivalence on self-reliance, certain kinds of Maoist ideas about developing the man of the future and whatnot are sympathetic to and adjacent to what we can call Nietzschean and Bolshevism, something that I've also studied because it's fucking weird. I mean, like
so weird. Yeah, it's so weird.
I mean,
it's like it's the same dynamic. I'm sorry to say, as with Thai, which is when you have an ultra spiritualist Nietzscheanism, they reproduce a new religion. Like that's what it does, and that's what Nietzsche did. And I'm just gonna say anecdotally, I have a few friends that are like hardcore Batayists, and they ended up Catholic at the end of it. Like that's what happens, right? Like there's nothing wrong with that, you know, whatever. But like spiritual Nietzscheanism is an oxymoron. It should be an oxymoron, but it's not actually. Like that's a way to read him, right? There's many ways you can read him. You know.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I have pointed out, even to anti-Nietzschean scholars, that I don't know that why they don't make more of this, for example, is esoteric radical traditionalism. In terms of like René Guénon or Julius Evola,
Alexander Dugin today.
Yeah, Alexander Dugin today, exactly, can be legitimately and directly traced back to Nietzsche. That to me is it's not necessarily a condemnation. There's all kinds of stuff in those guys. It's bizarre.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Some of it I understand. Some of it I frankly don't. Even when I have with someone like Evola, I actually have a pretty good grasp of the religions he's talking about, and I'm still lost of what he's doing. But one of the arguments I've made against the Kaufmanite kind of liberal Nietzscheans is that I cannot say that Evola or Dugin or de Benoist or Goulam Faye or any of those guys, any of these like French, Russian, and German like romantic reactionary conservatives or new rightist, and by new right in that context means something different than new right does here.
Sure.
We don't mean neoconservatives here in this regard. That I can't say they're not legitimate heirs of part of Nietzsche.
Right.
What I'm more interested in, and I guess this is where our difference really comes in, because I think everything you've said so far, I'm like, yeah, I definitely see that. I think it's true. There are still elements of Nietzsche that even in these things that you're talking about here, such as the pacifying a laboring class, which is clear, which I think is clearly and not metaphorically meant in Nietzsche. Like you can't read it Das Zarathustra without noticing it.
Even the
You
Kaufman
definitely can't-
translation. Yeah.
Even in the Kaufman translation, which is not the translation I'd read of that.
Right.
I also think if you read his bromides against Plato and his ambivalence about Aristotle, who he ends up kind of ultimately more or less celebrating,
Yeah.
that you will see it there as well. You know,
Right.
and you know the category of the natural slave, which is definitely a category in Aristotle, does seem to rear its head in Nietzsche. And again, I think that's not something that you can deny. What I find interesting is, you know, people, and I'm going to name names, someone like Jonas Sikas, the writer of How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, will somewhat convincingly say that Nietzsche, unlike most other reactionaries of the time, including people like de Maistre or even later people like Spengler, does center struggle, and particularly struggle of classes, as the movement. Well, I guess de Maistre also does this actually, but as the mover of history. But I don't think I think that can cut in a lot of different directions, because Nietzsche definitely, for all of his talk against resentment, pretty clearly resents slave morality. Like there is kind of an undercurrent of admiration for its cunning, but in general, he sees it as a regressive, the birth of a great lie. You know,
Right. I mean, that's the whole thing with Übermensch, is that, you know, when we talk about resentment and we talk about how resentment, this is why Max Scheller's text on resentment is so important, because one of the things he's saying is that, look, Nietzsche's right to identify this as a major, because he's coming out of phenomenological orientation and kind of like affect theory before we knew what affect theory was. It's a great text that Scheller writes. He says, one, Nietzsche's wrong about Christianity as the driving force of resentment. And he's also wrong about precisely the class dynamic of resentment. And for Nietzsche, again, this is maybe hard for Nietzscheans to swallow, but at the end of the day, he has a lot to say about the importance of mediocrity. And that may sound strange, but he says, quote, "The dwarfing of man must for a long time count as the only goal, because a broad foundation has first to be created so that a stronger species of man can stand upon it." Again, why did Nietzsche support the Christian church, the bourgeois church, in its imperial role in the Opium Wars in China? He did that because he wanted workers who were aimless and falling into this decadence and lack of purpose and so on to go off and fight. And he even would say things, and this is where some of these points about, look, if this situation of the underclass gets so bad, we need eugenics. We need to get rid of people. Like, that's on the table for Nietzsche. But again, he's thinking about that along class lines, right? So, okay, good luck as a socialist, you know, finding great insight there. You can find great insight there, but you need to be humble that this is insight for literally the 180 of what you're trying to further. And as to whether Sika is aware of that, I mean, I think to some extent he is, and I'd love to chat with him about that in the future. I think I'm trying to bring a much more references from how Marxists historically have really looked at Nietzsche. I mean, look, Derick, it's no surprise that Lukács was canceled after he wrote his essay on Nietzsche by Adorno, because if you read it, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh shit, he just closed down the case. Like, there's nothing that we can learn from this guy. In a way. I mean, it's a really strong rebuttal of Nietzscheanism, right? And Adorno says that Nietzsche is an ironist. because we live in a post-Hegelian. There's no dialectical interaction between the forms. It's negative dialectics. So, Nietzsche can kind of step in and play this kind of parody irony game. And so therefore the kind of relativism of Nietzscheanism could be put into conversation with contemporary philosophy, according to Adorno. And he thinks that Lukács closes that down, because for Lukács says, look, Nietzsche created and furthered what he calls aristocratic epistemology. It's an interesting category, which is this. And you see it in Jung, you see it in Dugan, you see it in Nivola, etc., which is common characteristics to affirm truth qua irrationalism, and to affirm a select caste capable of accessing that absolute, which is why Alexander Herzen, Nietzsche read widely. It's a whole interesting thing. God, he's such a madman. Are you aware that it's likely that he removed books that he read because he didn't want subsequently his reputation for people to know that he read them? Are you aware that when he was incoherent for 2 years of his life, his sister would host these dinner parties with all of his dignitaries, and he would sit there at complete silence at the dinner table on display as the Superman? But look, Nietzsche studied Hegelianism of its time, and he was terrified by aspects of Hegelianism because of its connection to socialism. So then he creates a kind of set of theories where this kind of egalitarian, open access to truth and so on is narrowed, right? It always has to be thought of in caste form. So yeah, Nietzsche thinks class. Hell yeah, he does. But he thinks class in a non-dialectical way. And it's quite hard in a Nietzschean utopia. Like I said, I read that quote about what is utopia is, to think of changing the status quo. I mean, even Alain Badiou in his book on Nietzsche says, look, eternal return is a brilliant doctrine for the preservation of the status quo. That's kind of what it's about. Now, existentialists can take it different directions, and you know, when you get into this kind of anti-materialist self-help domain, sure, you can do all kinds of fun stuff, right? I mean, read, I have it right here, Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle by Pierre Klosowski.
Yeah.
That's great. Have fun, but it's actually just, it's not furthering a kind of what I want to further. I'm not going to alienate anybody. I mean, he's a world historical figure. I'm just saying, look, for Marxists, let's look at the history. Let's look at what other Marxists have said. Let's be real, and let's learn from this guy. And he's our enemy. I mean, he's the best enemy you could find.
Yeah,
There's
is something.
Never a better enemy. There's never been a better enemy for Marxists.
I actually pointed this out in Lester Toe's, not the Nietzsche book, but actually his Liberalism and Counter History book, that I agreed with him. And I was like, well, Nietzsche is the best enemy we have.
Yeah.
He's the only person. There are some serious conservative and reactionary thinkers that we could be dealing with, but he's the only one of them that actually has broad appeal. Right. You know,
he's found a way to come into the left. He lives amongst us.
Right.
Most of these guys, they can be discarded. Look, isn't it a bit ironic that we just had a conversation recently about Christopher Lasch, and Christopher Lasch can bring people to tears on the left. Nietzsche's not bringing anybody to tears on the left.
Right.
Why
I was about to say,
the guy who wants masked slavery in different clothes is not going to, you know what I mean?
Right. Well, and also what he says about women, and almost every key, and that's one thing Kaufman could not clean up. I will say, he could not, I mean, Nietzsche this isn't ad hominem, but it's also true. Nietzsche as the first incel is not an inaccurate characterization of his relations and writing about women. Yeah. one of the things I think we have to deal with Nietzsche that I, and we're going to come to the last bit, which I think the part where there's maybe more fractures between us.
Sure.
Is that I have found Nietzsche to be, I take him at his word. But I do think in taking him at his word, we do find our best enemy. And I often think, for example, the point you made about ressentiment, like Nietzsche's right about the problems of ressentiment. He's right about the problems of the need to punish, but he's completely wrong, I think, or what I would, maybe not even wrong. He has a fundamental values difference about what I think that means and what we should do with it.
Exactly.
And
that is one thing that Malcolm Bull makes a nice point, which is historically, and this goes back to the debate we've had on equality in Marxism. Okay, what is that issue? Look, Marx himself said equality was a French limited bourgeois category that basically does not behoove us to try to further. It only leads to a type of Lassallean reformism. Right? Fair enough. My contention after looking at Lenin and looking at the conditions of neoliberal capitalism since the 1970s till now, keeping in mind the fact that the working class doesn't have near as much agency as it did during the time of Marx, that at a deeper level, we need to inculcate and shrug off this conception that my family has of this kind of naturalized inequality, right? Like, I'll give you a slight example to illustrate my point. My mom and I were watching Nomadland, and you've probably seen the movie, right?
Yeah.
And I said, Mom, what do you think about the class dynamics in that film? She's like, what class dynamics? I'm like, what? Like, Mom, like, first of all, just as an aside, like, my mom's gone through a lot of the stuff this woman has gone through, by the way. But she's so inculcated into this American ideology of naturalized inequality that my mother couldn't see this woman's suffering from a class perspective. And I realized at that point that, like, I'm not doing my job well enough to, like, alert people that this actually, and again, I'm not saying that Nietzsche is responsible for this, but I think, again, going back to Strauss's point about his influence, he's a little responsible for it. Okay. And
at the very minimum, I think that American Nietzscheism book, like, makes it pretty clear that you can pick up on, I approach people like Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers very dialectically, and I agree with everything Lacerda says about them. I still ultimately think it was a progression in history from British bullshit, but there's that natural aristocratic idea, the idea of, instead of an arbitrary aristocracy, we'll just have an organic one.
Yeah.
Nietzsche fleshes out in a way that would also appeal it, and I think people miss this because he seems so esoteric and weird, but the appeal to the classical world and that late 19th century, like, post-romantic love of the Greek, which is what, I mean, I even go so far as to say the reason why we think of the Greeks as white is not Greek revivalism. It has nothing even to do with philosophy or Christianity. The reason why we think of Greeks as white is 18th, 19th, and 20th century German philology, almost totally.
Yeah.
And the English response to that.
Right.
Like, otherwise they would be in some weird ambivalent category, like, the Arabic world, the Islamic world in general, parts of the Asian world, etc., that we wouldn't know what to do with. And Nietzsche's appeal to that fits the American mindset in a lot of ways too, because all of our civic religion was explicitly and deliberately, and this early bourgeois, proto-bourgeois way, cultivated on Greek and Roman classics. As an alternative to the to Christian monarchies or whatever.
Yep.
So I think there is a way in which even more than with Europeans, except for maybe the Germans and to some degree
Right.
French, there's elements of Nietzsche that, particularly once you strip out you try to strip out any inherent aristocratic and move it all to meritocratic aristocracy.
Right. Which again, we should remember that in a book called The Dionysian Conspiracy on Nietzsche and Napoleon, Donald Dombrowski, who's one of the greatest American Marxists, he's an academic, but he's still very much worth reading. He puts together this incredible text, the political writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, and this painting on the cover is just an incredibly fascinating background I can mention in a moment. But Dombrowski shows in that book on Napoleon that actually, no, Nietzscheanism was a hypermeritocracy because he was trying to concoct, and this is the really weird thing about Nietzsche's racism, and God, it is so weird, a cosmopolitan, transracial elite overclass, which would include Jews, of course. Mm-hmm. So just like Hegel, like W.E.B. Du Bois used Hegel for Black people, right? You could use Nietzsche for a certain theory of liberation, because ultimately it's about a hyper-meritocratic Ubermensch elite that repeat what Napoleon did, and they're prepared for warfare, for facing the end of the world, for facing climate catastrophe. You could, not many people are doing this, but you could have a kind of Nietzschean praxis. And what I think happens, though, is that this happened in Bolshevism. Lenin was worried about it. Others were worried about it. You get, and Gramsci was very worried about this as well. I know you have struggles with Gramsci, but his stuff on Nietzsche was interesting here because, again, what happens to Marxist hierarchy? Put it this way. If we think that Lenin's theory of vanguard has any relevance, ask yourself, what would Nietzscheanism combined with vanguard theory actually look like? Would it look like the Platypus Society? I don't know. Like, what would it look like? Like, clearly both of us are, I think, interested in this question of leadership on the left. I would wager that a Nietzschean infused ethos of leadership has the potential to be quite detrimental. I'm not going to totally close it down. I'm not a dogmatic person. Just think that it's something to be careful of. I'm just going to say that.
Well, let's turn to this for a second, because this question of the Frankfurt School in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a way in which people will do the vulgar conspiracist stuff about them being brought over by the CAA, which they weren't.
Even if they were, I mean, it doesn't
really matter.
Yeah.
Honestly, the people I recently read an article that was going after Horkheimer and Adorno and like not going after Marcuse, and I'm like, so you, of the big three, you don't mention the one who actually worked for the OSS,
right?
As opposed to the two who didn't. But I do think, and this is fascinating to me. I have always struggled with the Adornian, Horkheimerian hyper hostility to Heideggerianism.
Yeah.
But their love of Nietzsche in particular.
Yeah.
Even after, in many of their interlocutors, and Lukács being the most famous and prominent one, give it up. Like,
right.
What do you think it spoke to when you also think about them being people who thought the capitalist totality had subsumed relations to the point that there was no outside, and maybe the workers were the most reactionary force? I mean, like, they don't say that, but they do play with that idea.
It's a tough question. I mean, Horkheimer does say at one point that Nietzsche is more important than Marx, which is a terrible point. I mean, it's a point which I think a true Marxist would say, oh, well, he's compromised. And maybe he is in a way. I think for Adorno, his general thrust of thought and where Nietzsche fits is similar to what Ernst Bloch also realized with Nietzsche, which I think every Marxist has to realize at some point with Nietzsche, which is that something of his corpus needs to be retained. And people will choose different things. Like for me, I'm most interested in resentment because I see it as the issue. I want to revise pretty much all of it and credit him as a kind of, that's what Nietzsche does. Losurdo says, actually Nietzsche himself says, and Losurdo draws attention to this a lot, I have smelled politics where it's never been smelled before. That's actually what genealogy is. It's showing that all of these so-called depoliticized zones of life, like Nietzsche is so political that the opera can be read politically for him. You see my point? So, but look, for Adorno, you know, they reference Nietzsche's reference in Dialectics of Enlightenment as providing a kind of skepticism on enlightenment, which is a whole motif that Nietzsche brings to the table. For Ernst Bloch, it was a kind of Dionysianism that was needed at the origin of the proletarian politics, as well as I think he also gets a bit on this notion of how he thinks of the eternal return as a splitting of time and this kind of futural utopian dimension. So he turns Nietzsche towards a Marxist utopian dimension through eternal return. So Marxists can have the freedom. I'm not closing anything down. In fact, I would want to open things up more than Losurdo would. Losurdo has this notion of what he calls hermeneutics of innocence. It's very valuable. It's very real. It's a real issue. But maybe it also has the somewhat of a limitation. And I know my friend Harrison Fluss will maybe be a little upset with me for saying this, in the sense that, because part of the problem is that if you really are an anti-Nietzschean, what we lack, if you really are that, is a clear ethics by which how to actually work with his ideas. Like if you truly are of that position, like, okay, I can't ignore him. Again, the Straussian injunction of his influence and the fact that much of his insights and concepts, I mean, what has Nietzsche done to the Marxist study of the periodization of historiography? He's done a lot. Foucault, for all of his Nietzscheanism, what he's done to genealogical historical study needs to be furthered by Marxists, right? So, you know,
to be rematerialized by Marxists so we can talk about transitions and shit, not just epistemes and discourse patterns.
Exactly. It's like Foucault gives a history of the 19th century without anything about 1848 or French Revolution or Paris Commune. He doesn't care about that stuff, right? But we do. So, but he also opens all these other things, right? So look, it's an ethics of reading, you know? It's an ethics of reading. And Nietzsche's a reactionary thinker, but he's a lot more than that. And he's the most important enemy that I think we have in thought.
Right. I mean, he is definitely the most important, and I think he's also when I say he's legitimately dangerous, I actually mean that in an admirable way, because it's so rare to read anything that I actually feel that is fundamentally threatening.
Well, no, look, look, like Jung said. I mean, during that time, part of the reason Kaufman probably did do what he did with the translations is because we did have Nietzschean psychotics. Like that was a thing. Like there were readers of Nietzsche that became like murderers, killers. I mean, Nietzsche celebrated criminality. Like that's a thing. Like there's this stuff we got to revisit here and be like honest about.
Yeah, the lumpen aristocracy is a big Nietzsche deal. Absolutely. And it, you know, I mean, interestingly enough, you know, and I will say this as a person who this was very attractive to as a teacher, this is where that joke is kind of ironically true, and it's particularly true, I think, for male people of any of the lower classes, not just working class, lumpen, etc.
Sure.
Is the idea of criminality being something other than what one is forced into. It becomes, you know, lumpenization becomes not just a tragedy, but an element of my assertion of aristocracy. And that's why the Robert Greene book is so popular, even though, as I've often said, I mean, I actually like Robert Greene, weirdly. I think his book on human nature is actually not bad. I also think he's a rather milquetoast liberal if you really push him.
Right.
Um,
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the other thing that Losoto brings out, which is really hard for Nietzscheans to really bear, which is that most of the time, if you carefully study the oscillations of Nietzsche's politics, which again were so complex and attentive, a lot of times he was taking actually the line of liberalism, not in rhetorical, stylistic form, but practically. And at the end of the day, it's a liberalism that Nietzsche and Nietzscheanism, after it's adopted, fit within the kind of matrices of liberal class interests. So that's hard for Nietzscheans to. I think the other danger or the other interesting thing about the Marxist reading of Nietzsche is that you can also circumvent the out that a lot of academic Nietzscheans give to him, which is that he was mad. He was a mad genius. Well, because the Marxists understand Nietzsche as putting forward this thesis on human suffering, where it's like those rare Ubermensch exempt from wage labor suffer at a higher level. If you really are a working class person, you really understand the gravity of that position. Like, I'm sorry, but that's just going to make you go crazy if you read a little Marx. And so I don't really care if he's mad. Like, that's what he wants, and that's not going to fly. So, I don't want your excuses, is what I'm trying to say. So, like, I want to be careful of not repeating the kind of, because Jack London had this famous quote where he says, I'm going to put this as an epigraph in my book: the socialists never understood my critique of Nietzsche. And we run a risk of not communicating this critique well. Like, you see my point, because he's so seductive and he's so popular. And when you challenge him, you're challenging the inbuilt attachments, which are passionate and emotional, that people have to him, because he has set people free. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, got to be careful. Right?
Yeah, well, this leads. You will find this amusing. And I'm going to be more personal than I normally am on these things, because it's one of the rare times where life, class, and academic philosophy actually overlap. I was going through a divorce, and I had reclused, and I was living in South Korea, and I had become good friends with a professor there who was, a good literature scholar and of the generation that we are, and he was our age, would have been, some kind of Nietzsche Marx hybrid, had a kind of, at the time, facile understanding of Marx. That's no longer true, to defend him, because he'll know I'm talking about him. But he threw this Nietzsche resentment overman thing at me, and and my response was actually very similar to yours. I was like, look, I have two ways I can read this, and that is, this is good advice, but the person giving it, fundamentally, the weight of what he's saying is even too much for him, and plays into his psychosis, whether it is from any number of reasons, including the syphilis hypothesis, which I think has now been debunked. So that's not really an out, or it doesn't actually seem possible for a normal human to do. And while it's useful as some kind of weird aspirational thing, could also be just as useful in keeping me from doing other things I need to do to make my lot in life better.
Right.
Yeah,
so he was saying that you're responding to the divorce and that you need to overcome
I need to overcome myself and overcome and I was just like, I don't think people actually really do that.
Right.
You can adjust to it. You can and people are going to be, because I always talk about revolutionary pessimism and all this, but I will actually say you can learn an optimism beyond positive thinking that is kind of like a tool set.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
This is one of the things that I actually do take out of classical psychoanalysis, and Alfred Adler, who's, one of my people that people are always shocked by because he's associated with hyper-individualism. but where I'm like, you can take this and do something with it. But what you can't really do is you can use it, but using it's not really overcoming it. It is part of what you are. And I kind of just rejected this aristocratic notion. I was like, you know, there's nothing that I'm going to do that will remove the weight of my class background, my ethnic heritage, and both the positive and negative sense, my the events of my life, my individual psychological traumas, and other than in some ways incorporating and even maybe in some ways in incorporating also rejecting those traumas, right? But as a guide for life, Nietzscheanism sounds good until you think about it and then look at his own life. Now, when you bring that to the class scale, which Nietzsche does, and beyond the individual, this becomes, I said to my friend, and I was like, look, I know you didn't have everything delivered to you on a silver spoon, but the fact that you come from an educated middle class background here, and I'm not using Marxist terminology here, but I think this is important.
Right.
And you're meeting someone who comes from a lower middle class, working class background, who does have some exposure to education through extended family. I think your attitude about Nietzsche actually comes from the fact that we come from different places.
Right.
And I found Nietzsche appealing when I was young because it was this justification of my own ability to come out of my own class. And then I discovered that even when I did come out of my own class, I mean, objectively, I didn't really. There was no total break with the habitus of my childhood, etc. And when you think about that in political terms, not just in like personal psychological terms, that has big implications. And so when I read Malcolm Bull's book, I actually read it trying to answer this guy, and then was not satisfied with his answer. I remember just going like, well, anti-aesthetics. I don't think we need an anti. I think we need a proletarian aesthetics, and I don't mean that, but I also don't mean it in the purely workerist way where we just like celebrate the proletariat as it is now and what it enjoys now as it currently exists.
Right.
Like, I mean, like, what would it look like for us? And this was the attractiveness of the Adornian vision of Nietzsche for me. What would it look like for us to do that ourselves? But I think ultimately that's not Nietzsche. Like, if you think that's Nietzsche, you're misreading Nietzsche.
That's true.
You're projecting other not rehabilitations, but reappropriations of him to a left politics in a limited way.
That's right.
And maybe we should just admit that it has to be partial and we're doing something different.
Yeah, this is why, like, in one of my philosophical mentors, Alain Badiou, he has this idea that of the event, that like, there's four kind of domains of human life where events take place, which fundamentally change the situation. And then he tries to create kind of ontology that can kind of give us a kind of measure and a framework to understand political events, artistic events, and so on. But he says within philosophy, philosophers don't produce events. And then he says, but there are these other kind of philosophers, what he calls anti-philosophers, and they do produce events. And Nietzsche is an example of somebody who did produce the Nietzsche event, which is all of the bombastic grandiosity of splitting the world in two, of my philosophy will not be read for X amount of years. And of course, if you actually look at what he means by that, he's actually prophesizing the coming of great wars in Europe and how his true overman ethics won't happen until after those wars are settled. So he's not only predicting World War I, he's saying that my philosophy won't take off until it's over, which is exactly what happened, right? Which is crazy. But look, Bull's book is interesting for one reason. He reminds us of Gramsci's critique of Nietzsche, which should be taken and internalized by everybody on the left today, in my opinion, which is this. Bull says that the Jacobins, after the French Revolution, reached a point where they tried to inculcate full equality. And it was at that point, and he says Nietzsche points this out as well in his study of the French Revolution, because Nietzsche studied the French Revolution in all of its sequences very closely. And he says it was the introduction of full equality of the wage, in a certain law that was put forward, I forget the name of it, that Jacobinism failed. And so interesting to me, it's why, Derick, I'm so interested in equality in a sense as a Marxist, recognizing that equality is problematic. But I'm interested on two levels. One, Nietzsche says that the introduction of greater equality produces resentment, but he also says that revolution from below cannot solve resentment itself. And I wish to say in my chapter on this issue that if we affirm that Nietzschean position, then we might as well not be Marxists, because he says it's about catharsis. Gramsci calls it catharsis, which is, I think, a beautiful point, which is, we need to decide our position on revolution, in a sense, especially in the era of global warming and the crisis that we face today. We may live in a revolutionary moment in our lifetime. It is possible. I know we were talking earlier about Lasch and the hollowed proposition of revolution. But look, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. And I would be on the side of being a pro-revolutionary. I'm not going to be accused of being some phony, no, like, seriously, like, revolutions happened, and Nietzsche created a philosophy which tried to say that revolution from below only furthers and re-entrenches resentment, and equality is a part of that. Now, I haven't resolved how exactly we're going to deal with equality. I know it's problematic, but my wager is we need to think it. We need to think it beyond the confines of bourgeois equality. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think this is actually interesting because I had a long conversation with my friend Esri XB over this, and I, being kind of diehard like, I often get accused of being an orthodox Marxist, but I actually don't think it's true. I don't think that I bring in too many other, from psychoanalysts to systems theory to neurology to anthropology that is beyond Marx. So I can't be, I'm not truly speaking orthodox, but I do think understanding what orthodoxy was, maybe this is a platypus holdover, maybe this is one of the few things I'm sympathetic with them on in a profound way, really is important. And I get Marx's critique of equality as stated in both French and bourgeois thought, that it is too abstract, that it actually misses the point, and that the only way to deliver it is to take all things and pretend that the realm of law can somehow be declassed, which also Marx, in agreement, one of the few things he agrees with anarchists on profoundly is that you can't have a declassed state form, that doesn't make sense. It's just fundamentally, I mean, even Lenin is pretty clear on this. That's fundamentally not possible. And that, dictatorship of the proletariat is a state form only in so much that you need one to transition out of it. But I have come around to the idea that egalitarianism in a specific sense, and by that I mean, like, I usually talk about power egalitarianism. All right. Yeah, exactly. And power egalitarianism would imply pretty strong relative wealth egalitarianism, or at least egalitarianism in the access to productive capacity. I'm not even going to say capital, because I would, in my ideal world, they're like the commodity form's gone. But I don't dwell on it like some people, but it is my ultimate goal. And that requires the idea that there are no power differences that are enforced from the outside, and Marx actually makes this clear in the Critique of the Werther program, inculcated from inside. So you don't, for example, you don't emphasize natural inequities in, like, say, physical difference by giving everyone exactly what they contribute, because one, that would kill a lot of people, and Marx is well aware of that, and two, in a fundamental way, and this almost sounds liberal to a lot of people's ears, we're not actually concerned with fairness. We're concerned with making fairness irrelevant.
Right.
And I became convinced that that is a kind of equality. It's just not the way most people talk about it. And
Yeah.
saying that I want to make equality irrelevant, in the sense that I'm like, no, I don't think we're all going to be equally intelligent. I don't think we're all going to be equally strong. I don't think human difference is still a thing.
Yeah.
But what I do think we should all have is equal input into our futures, even if that involves things we don't want to do.
Right. Like Nietzsche, exactly. I think I totally right, which is Nietzsche did not center equality in relation to the mode of production. He centered it in a grand archaic struggle between impersonal forces and a will which contends in that arena, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I reject that framework. However, I also recognize that in a true Marxist sense, we need to come up with a different, what then would equality tether itself to in order to prepare the proletariat to live under a new law from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. That's an unknown to me. I confess. Right. I don't think that Marxists have really developed that. And I will say another thing. One thing that is good about post-Marxists, I don't even like that term. Let's just say
traitors. No.
Yeah, no. Like Etienne Balibar, Alain Badiou, Occidental Marxists. The Marxists who say, I have a theory of justice. Marx didn't have a theory of justice. I'm giving it to you. Alain Badiou has written a couple books about that.
Right, yes.
Okay, fine. We can agree or disagree. I agree with the impulse that it's an unfinished dimension of Marxism. I agree with the impulse that because Marx didn't elaborate it, that doesn't mean that we can't touch it. No, we need to work on it. Yeah, that means we need a Marxist theory of justice. I'm sorry. Okay, so, but
I
look,
think you may have actually hit on a
Nietzsche invites us to do that. Nietzsche invites us to do that. It's another example. Ressentiment. He's locating something. His prescription is all messed up, but let's follow what he's locating. He's a great detective, and he identifies things which God knows only a maniacal, aristocratic madman could identify. Right? That's actually why Nietzsche actually teaches us something about the dark parts of ourselves. Right? And
contradictory parts of ourselves, because I still don't know how you square Amor Fati with the Oberman, really. Except by arguing that the Oberman is natural, but then Nietzsche doesn't entirely want to do that.
No, right, exactly. The Overman needs to be kind of determined on a plane of contesting forces, ultimately, right? There needs to be a kind of, I mean, it would be interesting to see where Nietzsche would fall on today's political spectrum, who he would align with, what he would celebrate, where his camp would be. Would it be a Jordan Peterson? Would it be a Sloterdijk? Would he be with us? I mean, who knows? There's this really interesting book about how contemporary liberalism is producing a ruling class of mediocrities.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely is.
Right? And it's called Mediocrity by a Canadian author. I forget, Donalo or something like that. And it is doing that. Okay. Well, that's an example of what Nietzsche would want to reverse. Yeah? Because mediocrity needs to exist, but it needs to exist from below. And my contention as a Marxist is that from below, there's profound, unrealized potential that we don't know about and that we need to open and allow to express itself. That's a Marxist Nietzschean approach. And, you know, the ruling class has lost legitimacy today. They've lost efficacy of their rule. They don't have any compelling ideology. They're not making good art. They're not making good films. I don't know about you, but the pandemic has made me feel like my old uncle, who at one point said, I don't watch any Hollywood movies. I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of at that point now, you know? So we have a real crisis of decadence in our culture. We do, right? And again, Nietzsche gives us a way to deal with decadence, right? It's just a model. Again, it's the theme we're going here. He opens up a problem. We follow it. That's how we stay true to a kind of subversive, maybe subversive is the right way to say, reading of him.
Yeah, I think that's all fair enough. I mean, in one sense, we do. The funny thing about it, however, is when you think about it, Nietzsche already exists in a world ideologically where the concerns of safety, of ideational safety, the kind of shit that the heterodox academy people of the intellectual dark web, who aren't the same, I will admit, but are close, will complain about. I mean, that world is real, and yet it actually exists permeated with Nietzsche already in it.
Yep.
Like that, you know, I have always thought about the great irony of everybody I know who seemed to have read Foucault liked Foucault's version of Nietzsche and then decided they wanted to build Bentham's Panopticon anyway. Like that is the world that we kind of live in. And and so in some sense, maybe in this sense I may be even more critical of Nietzsche than you, is whatever his radical spirit is, it's been tamed by his pervasiveness in the culture.
Yeah, maybe.
But there is, I will also say though, when I open up some Nietzsche texts, they still sometimes feel very electric, in a way that Marx does to me. Alain Badiou sometimes, although sometimes I you were talking about, I was talking about my disagreement with you. I'm like,
right.
I think justice is something you talk to children about, but it's in a sense though, I do think, here's where I'm sympathetic. When someone says to me, well, how do you answer to someone who calls for justice with a Marxist like shrug? And I'm like, look, we can't have analogies for everything, but I have to admit, we do have to answer that question. Even if we say, okay, there's not a Marxist theory of justice, well, what are we offering you? We have to offer you something. Right. We have to offer you and one thing that you and I actually probably share, and I don't think people get from my videos, so I'm going to state it explicitly. I actually, and this is a part of me that I think a lot of people see as sympathetic to communitarians, I actually believe in consequentialist objective in terms of processes ethics, which means I'm a virtue ethicist. Meaning like you state your goal, that's your orientation, right, and you do the objective things that would get you to that goal, and those goals can be stated in abstract ideas. I think proletarian ethics and virtue ethics, that what's interesting about that is that admits, for example, bourgeois ethics and proletarian ethics are going to be different because we're going to naturally have different goals. Yes. And those goals would be delineated differently.
Yes.
And what Nietzsche wants to say to that is, well, that's just you asserting your power and it's a trap. And what I want to say back is like, it's not a trap, but I do kind of want to assert my power. Yes. Right. But I don't want to assert it just for my sake. It's not that cloistered and cynical. I don't even see myself as delimited, particularly in my individual self.
Yeah.
And I do think that's the kind of thing maybe we should be interested in talking about as an answer to justice, are what we mean by equality, because we have to mean something different than liberals. Right. Because we can't mean like the absolute.
I totally agree. I mean, I actually think there's two levels to equality, right? Like, so there's this primordial equality of like the woman or the man in prison, like trying to understand equality in the abstract, and Nietzsche gives you an answer to that. Then there's equality of praxis, of building a community. And remember, Nietzsche's philosophy is a community building philosophy. And the free spirits were meant to be unencumbered by what he called class incrustations. So he used the metaphor of the sea and not being tethered down, and movement, and the freedom that comes from that. Nietzsche said, any idea that's ever shaped human history has never been written sitting down. Right? Nietzsche is a philosopher of movement. It's kinetic, which is why scholastic academics are drawn to him, because he's the one that he's trained in their arts of philology and books. He's read as much as they have, but he can get them out of their seats, right? And he's not a pretentious one, right? He's done his homework. Okay, but what kind of community is he trying to build? That's the question for Marxists to answer. And I think that the interesting thing there is what Nietzscheanism has done historically, which has produced a youthful revolt. It's been individualist often. It's attracted artists. Nietzsche's huge with the avant-garde. And you can see why. I mean, if the Marxist view on the petty bourgeoisie is right, the petty bourgeoisie doesn't see itself as a class, who do you think their philosopher is going to be? Right?
Yes.
That's
Anybody who can make them seem like they were going to be natural aristocrats. I mean, that's the weird. This is the tie. You know what? And this might be helpful for your book, but it's something that I think you would actually find explicitly in the works of Aleister Crowley, of all people.
Oh, that's a beautiful point. I'm going to take a note of that.
Where Crowley talks about American yeoman republicanism and Nietzsche being intimately linked in his critique of like British monarchical morality.
Brilliant.
And I mean, he says it in a way that's good. I'm like, well, that shit terrifies me, but it is. I think it's there. I mean, I think that's also something I saw in American Nietzsche. So that's something I saw in, because I've read a lot of occult Nietzsche shit. This is a hazard of some of the roads that I've traveled in, and you know, in the weirdo paleo conservative far right world, which in some ways I think leftists actually give too much credit. It's not near like in some ways Maury Rothbard's a bigger threat to you than Julia Savola. But
right.
But there is a sense though that there's a weird overlap that you find you start. I think about. I don't know if Molyneux has ever. I quit listening to Stefan Molyneux years and years ago, like way before it came out as a nationalist. But I used to follow him because even when I was a right winger, he's been around in my circles for like 20 years. Yeah. And he was even derided by other right wingers as a cultist. But there is a way in which you saw this kind of Nietzschean ethos, a kind of individualist collectivism being encouraged there, and then encouraged to cut your ties from family, from class, from whatever.
Yep.
And then build this up. And so, you know, the petty bourgeois guru figure in particular, Nietzsche is at least weaponizable for in a way that I don't think is necessarily the honest use of Nietzsche, but it's easy because it's there.
Like, well, that's actually why I'm reading the late Nietzsche, and he starts to realize that he's a community builder. And you know, there's 2 points of reference that he lionizes there: Saint Paul and Pascal. Why Saint Paul? Saint Paul was very fond of Christ's message that those who truly follow me are willing to renounce their mother, their father, their brother, their sister. Okay. There's other reasons, but that's interesting. And then Pascal, because Pascal created a kind of quasi-bohemian class of dissident followers of the church who are a bit like the dime square Catholic thing we have in today's discourse. They're kind of these like bougie rebels who appear like nomadic rebels, but ultimately are in alliance with the core ideology. They don't want to change anything about the church. In fact, what their function is to symbolically satiate popular discontent by portraying their resistance to the authority. And that's a very sophisticated form of that Pascal took. And of course, Lucien Goldman's book on this called The Hidden God, where he shows, speaking of equality, it was Pascal versus the Pelagian conspiracy. It's kind of Pascal versus proletarian universalism that was at the origin of Augustinian Western Christianity as the two poles, which became transposed into the class struggle of bourgeoisie and proletariat. And the interesting thing about that was that, okay, bourgeoisie needs a Pascal. They need a Nietzsche. They need a figure to give a kind of, I don't know, petty bourgeois form of revolt or something like that, right?
Well, I mean, it is interesting when we talk about youth revolts. We can talk about this in the most obvious sense that everyone from Lash to Joseph Heath, in Canada, has talked about, like the rebel cell, the instant recuperation of this. But in a way, and I would say what I'm articulating here is not sufficiently materialist enough for me. I would have to spend years looking at all the outlying conditions that created the environment for this to come out of and generate a Nietzsche, because I don't believe people, I do actually believe individual character matters,
right?
But I don't believe people sui generously come from nothing.
Well, hold on a second. This is actually what the Dionysian myth is about.
Okay.
I want to say something. This is how sophisticated Nietzsche is. He locates the transgressive community that he's founding as a recurring historical feature of past civilizations. And he's the madman of ours. He's the Dionysius of ours, you see? So Nietzsche's already answered that question for us. That's the Dionysian principle, which is interesting. I mean, wow. Okay, wow. He's always ahead of us, and that's why he needs to be read. I mean, that's part of the thing. When anybody writes a book on Nietzsche, what you're really doing is saying, let's read him again. It's like Freud, it's like, come back, let's start over. Let's read him again. And look, I'm no genius, man. I don't even believe in the whole category of genius, but let's just read him again. That's a good gesture, right? It's a really good gesture.
All right. Well, I think that's a good point to end on, because it's actually a point where we weirdly agreed. I think people will be surprised that we agreed on 80% of things on this one.
I don't even, honestly, this has been just delightful and just inspiring to me personally to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I you will be back on the show because you're a good interlocutor for this side of what I do. I have a similar ambivalence about Hegel, who I see as a much more. I mean, I actually really see him as personally ambivalent. I think he's a revolutionary and simultaneously, a prophet of bourgeois normality at the same time. And I think that I also joked with you once on Twitter, and I don't think people got my joke, where I was like, I actually take seriously the McGee thesis, and also think the McGee thesis is vulgar. For those of you who don't know, that that Hegel's really influenced by Hermetic philosophy and Christian esotericism. I think that's true. I just don't think it's a real critique. Like I'm like okay, so he still came up with fellowtification. That if I thought that was a problem, I would also have to think that, say, the weird Pythagorean mythicism and early Platonism is a problem, and it's a problem all the way to people like Alain Badiou, which I would just find a ridiculous assertion. Like
I think Hegel is a scandal because I basically believe Lukács, which is Hegel's a scandal because he completed philosophy. Like he completed it. Like he completed aesthetics. He completed the phenomenology, completed the higher logic, and taken at face value, it all works. It's a coherent system. And that itself disrupted philosophy and forced it into a crisis. And then, of course, Lukács says, well, what happened when that occurred? The workers' movement, Marxism. Marxism is the natural heir to philosophy. It takes Hegelian insights and brings it into the world. So, that's my reading of Hegel. Yeah. I'm not as convinced of this this does get esoteric when we insist on this, the primacy of Marx versus Hegel that Zizek does. I don't know about that. I don't, you know what I mean?
When we talk about Zizekian esotericism, I often, it's funny because every time I'm like, well, I actually was asked to weigh in by Lane on
the
Terry
Hegel
Pinkert versus Zizek.
Oh yeah,
and I'm like Terry Pinkert, like hands down, like I hate to be this way, but like whenever I'm like, and it's maybe it's my hostility towards Lacan. You can blame it on me, but whenever Zizek talks about Hegel, I feel like any bourgeois thinker that or even like left liberal thinker I've ever read on Hegel's been more clarifying to me than Zizek has been on Hegel, which is actually interesting because I don't feel that way about Zizek and Lacan. Like I feel like the Lacan that I understand is Zizek's Lacan. I'm not sure that it's Lacan's Lacan, but I understand Zizek's Lacan. Like I get it.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, no, I don't care for Slavoy's work on Hegel too much at all. I really don't. I'm not convinced that Lacan opens the secret door to truly understanding Hegel, because if that was true, then Zizek could have already said that by now. Although it's really interesting that it's kind of an interesting point about reading patterns of the American public. Are you aware that Zizek's most purchased book is his 1,000-page book on Hegel? It goes to show that, yeah, sure, we have an anti-intellectual culture. Okay, sure. But that's fact. But we also don't, right? Like, we also don't. Like, there's actually, people are hungry for this stuff, man. Like, it's a double-edged sword,
Right. It's not just weirdo academics. I mean, I also like to remind people Hart Negri's Empire was, on the top 10 bestseller list for, a year. In 1999, and I laugh because that book is wild in a lot of ways. But I'm like, yeah, it was. Every now and then we get a wild hair up our ass collectively over something like this, and I think,
and it's usually these really ambitious texts like Empire. Empire's trying to synthesize late 20th century Marxism in one text, right? And that's but that should be a message to all of us that want to write, which means that up your ambition. Don't lower your ambition. Up it. Come up with bigger ideas. That's what people want.
Well, I mean, there's a reason. I was complaining about the Guru form online, and I still complain about the Guru form, and I'm never going to stop complaining about the Guru form. But I actually do admire their ambitions, because one of the things that I think ancient philosophy really does speak to. And I don't separate ancient philosophy and religion. I think they're pretty much the same thing. Is particularly if you talk about dharmic religions and Confucianism as religions, and I'm like, and then ancient philosophy is definitely religious. But the ambition of philosophy as something that can provide a politics and ethics and an aesthetics, and if you provide those three things, you're providing a way of life. I feel like, unfortunately, the academicization of philosophy in the 20th century has, I think all the cranks are actually kind of right about that, like it's lost its ambition. And when somebody, and I'll even include a dipshit like Jordan Peterson in this, when somebody tries to answer that call and then says, like, even if they deliver it in arcane language, and tries to deliver it ambitiously to the public, every now and then people actually sticks.
People listen. Absolutely. Yeah, that's something that's why, like, we on the left need to build each other up and, like, encourage that kind of stuff.
Totally.
100%.
Yeah.
It takes courage too. I mean, it's not easy to feel the confidence to do that, because you're going to be, accused of being this or that. And, that's the other thing is, like, maybe the online thing is kind of good for us because at least it's giving us really thick skin and we can handle, like, attacks and recognize that those attacks may not be really directed at you, but you're kind of like only part of the attack. You know what I mean? Like, it's like there's more there than meets the eye with online shit. Right.
I actually, one of the things that I think that may be a good point, and as we wrap this up, and I want to think about this a little bit, because I think people only hear my criticisms of the online world, but my criticism of the online world is because the way capitalists have trained us to use the parasocial, they've trained us to substitute it for politics while claiming it's politics, where I actually think, no, it's not inherently bad. It's just that all of our instincts have been channeled, and I include most of the left on this. This is why I complain about Guru so much. Most of our instincts have been channeled in negative and in ways that the grandiosity is not answered sufficiently. It feels more like building up yourself than building up the project of the left.
That's true.
But one thing I will say is I agree with you this thick skinness, and the other thing I will say that it does is there are three trends in academia. Two of them I think are really bad. One of the academic trends I think are bad is it does domesticate your mind and often drives a wedge between your ability to communicate with normal people. All right. I think that's true. But at the same token, it does train you to be rigorous, to read both charitably and critically simultaneously, and to realize limitations.
Yeah.
What all those things will be good in a different context. And in academic context, I think the reason it becomes a problem is that academic modality is all about the transfer of social capital, and it is highly and somewhat arbitrarily hierarchical. And capitalists who want to take down the academy actually can rightly point to that.
Right.
And I think while some of the training that involved in such systems might actually be good for you, we need to replicate that in a way that doesn't replicate its hierarchicalness, or frankly, it's unbelievably parasitic bureaucracy at this point. That wasn't always true. That's a modern problem, but oh my God.
Right.
Totally.
I'm trying to do online education right now, and it's not easy. I mean, the challenge is, people don't get a sense of credit, so they're doing a supplement, which is fine. But in reality, if you can create a space where true study occurs and questions can be raised that wouldn't maybe be raised in seminars, and you're giving people access to like serious scholars, I think it's worth it.
Right.
And also I would say one other thing, which is I don't think we should be fearful of didactic work in education. And I know that you're obviously a huge proponent of that, creating these like YouTube videos. That's a good example of didactic, but like even like that famous quote from Eric Hobsbawm, which is his vision. He's a great anti-Nietzschean, by the way, of like, you know, on my lunch break, I would go into the factory and give a lecture on the history of 19th century labor unions for the factory workers, and they would eat their lunch and listen to me. And there's no resentments. There's no problems with me being a professor. I was welcomed. Yeah, right. Like, you know, that kind of intellectuality, right, interests me in a certain sense. And I think we have that. And I think in other conversations, I'd like to talk to you about some of these libidinal dynamics of socialist organizations. And I'd like to also introduce you to some of my friends doing work on the psychoanalysis of socialist organizations in peripheral countries as well as in Western countries. You should have some of them on your program because they've actually done like literal case studies of groups and tried to understand these dynamics of rivalry, backbiting, anti-solidarity, and how to like overcome them on the socialist left. And I think they might be really interesting to you.
It definitely would be, since I'm always trying to prove my there's a back motive to a lot of what I'm trying to do is to be like, James Burnham's and Machiavellians is wrong. Like,
Right.
You know,
Right.
And also we can overcome the problems of Michel Robert, which is not to say that they aren't real problems, but like, and what are the problems of Michel Robert? The Robert Michel, I can't remember which fucking French name, but which is the his whole oligarchy problem. But the oligarchy comes out from anti-solidaristic tendencies leading to elite capture, and everybody knows this is a problem. And we also do have examples against this as an inevitable problem. Historically, I think, you know, the Cordonas in Chile are one of the best counterexamples. They also don't survive very long, but that's not because of that problem.
Right. Right.
And I think
one of my friends said it really well, which is socialist organizations often fragment because one of the unacknowledged kind of premises of what socialist organizations try to inculcate is the problem of equality. Like, in other words, you're trying to introduce a different form of relationality that would be different than capitalist hierarchy that we normally experience it in. And that presents new problems. And in the same way that psychoanalysis, when you have free association, when you're given the freedom to freely associate without an interlocutor like you normally would in the real world, psychoanalysis argues that that's where you develop your symptoms, because you're forced to develop what Lacan would call the subject supposed to know, right? You actually develop a kind of fictitious otherness that then the analyst can see you doing and point things out, right? And anyway, so my comrades are kind of trying to do the same thing for socialist organizations and trying to basically trying to offer a consulting service. Because actually one other thing, like professionalization is important. How do you take people's professional skills and transplant them into there? And not be afraid to say, like, yeah, I'm offering consulting. Like, that's good, right? Like, you know, that kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, it's one of the, I have this, you know, I have a deeply ambivalent view of Maoism, but one of the things I actually like about Maoism, and it's not for the reasons people think. They think I want to punish academics, and I don't. Is rustification.
Yeah.
And it's not because I want to punish academics.
Right.
It's because I don't want us to be skill hoarding even accidentally.
Right.
Like,
Right.
and it's hard to do in the modern capitalist system because credentialing is kind of an artificial barrier.
Well, also because austerity also rustifies, but not on terms of our choosing.
Right. Well, exactly. It's not. Yes, we're being rustified, but we're not skill sharing.
Right. Exactly.
We're not being encouraged to either. I mean, in some ways we are. I mean, I will admit, like, academic podcasts are kind of a low key, unambitious skill sharing project. I mean, that's kind of what I'm doing. But
no, yeah, I would say Varn Vlog is much broader than an academic podcast. Much broader than that.
Yes,
obviously.
But it's interesting actually. What I here's I would agree with you, but also counter with this. I base what I do off of long form free interview podcast and academic podcast, not off of left podcast, which I haven't really stated explicitly that many times. But the reason why that is not because I'm anti-didactic. It's I actually find those forms of didactic engagement, maybe I shouldn't say this out loud, they're more effective because they drop people's barriers to didacticism as opposed to like a polemical podcast, a week, like Jacobin or Dissent Weekly, or even something like political humor like Chapo or whatever.
Sure.
And I think there's a place for all of that.
Yeah.
I will never have the audience that half those podcasts do.
Yeah.
But what you're going to get engaged out of it, what the engagement you get out of it is different because it requires attention. It requires sustained engagement, and it's not supposed to answer the questions for you. It's supposed to give you enough skills, interest, and stuff for you to begin to build this for yourself, which, this is one thing I think maybe we can end on this point, against Nietzsche. So I really truly believe that educational empowerment does not solve a lot of problems, doesn't solve most problems, but the hostility people have towards academics and intellectuals is not necessarily knee-jerk anti-intellectualism. It is because they understand the social and cultural capital games, often in ways that the people playing them don't even realize they're doing.
Right.
And that is the response people get, and why they think like workers don't like intellectuals. Because I'm like, that's not true.
Right, it's not true.
Like, it's just not true.
Well, I mean, that's true. That you're right. I mean, I think part of it is an intellectual is an issue. It's an issue of desire, in the sense that if you really are an intellectual, you're not going to let your class position, the barriers that you face, the struggles that you face, you're not going to let any of that stop you from what you're doing. If you really believe it, nothing will stop you from doing what you need to do. And in our economy, because of the class dynamics that we experience, a lot of people are told that, like, and this bothers me, obviously, that it's a zero-sum game. And that's this thing that one of the things that Nietzscheanism, I didn't mention, actually furthers, which is what I call the re-entrenchment of sadomasochism, which is when Nietzsche said, just listen to this statement, I only write my books for those whose lives turned out well. What he did there was he created a very interesting injunction. It's because it means two things. One, you know my audience. If you want to be my audience, you better be a winner. Then that is reverberated back onto us, and we are then forced to ask the question, am I a winner or a loser? Now, from a Marxist standpoint, I reject the presupposition, right? When we allow people to frame the reality of this system in those terms, that exacerbates. It's a weird thing of Nietzsche, because he's exacerbating resentment by saying that, right? That's what he's doing. Even though he wants to end it, he's actually increasing it, right?
And you can see this in right-wing Nietzscheans a lot of the time. They're often very resentful people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the highest of us are the ones who accept natural inequality as it is. And they have the courage to name it. I'm sorry, but I work on the opposite premise. And I think that people need to fight on the opposite premise. So there you go. I don't know. But man, I just want to say it's really been an honor to chat with you today. I really have enjoyed it. I really have.
Thank you for coming on. I think this has been, I actually think this is what is some of the most useful 2 hours, even though the other most useful 2 hours is me attacking Lukács for 4 hours. So, you know, because I mean, the interesting thing about Lukács is my response to him is ambivalence.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
This is a great theme, but because I don't think Marxism did what he promised it was going to do.
Right. I know. I need to listen to your interview with your
my former co-host Amog. Yeah,
co-host. Yes, I definitely.
He's writing his dissertation on Lukács, and it's basically like, yeah, this would be great if it was true, but it, at least as of yet, is not true, and we don't seem to be able to make it true. So, but he's also coming from a period of despair, and I weirdly, as I said to you earlier, I'm coming from a, you know, everyone always talks about optimism, you know, pessimism of the engine, but like optimism of the will, and I'm like, I used to not agree with optimism of the will, and now I kind of do. But I think the pessimism should be deeper than the intellect about the world that we exist in. I do think we should be absolutely pessimistic. About capital as it currently exists.
Correct.
And in fact, I would go so far as to say, I want you to be so pessimistic that you don't feel hopeless, that you feel like hope is irrelevant and you have to fight anyway, regardless of how you feel about it.
Right. It kind of brings us back to this category that Fanon used, which is what he called not the wretched, it should be called the damned of the earth. And what I liked about that was that is the proletarian position. For proletarian position truly to be proletarian position, I think that they need to undergo a feeling of being damned. Like your position is, you see my point? And that doesn't necessitate an eternal pessimism at all. It necessitates a different recognition, but you got to go through the experience of it. And there it is, right? It kind of goes back to this intergenerational wisdom piece, because I think I see my position in many lights as damned, but I'm okay with that. Like, you know what I mean? And so I'm, in that sense, I feel that I can overcome resentments, which I used to be more victim to. You know?
Yeah, I think, I mean, not to sound all Christian, that's not normally what I would do in my life, but I would say that there is some truth to the finding hope by totally losing it, leap that sometimes we ask. And I don't mean that in an accelerationist, we want the world to get worse so people rebel. I actually don't believe that, but I do believe that if you think that you can pour, I'm stuck with Christian metaphors today. If you can pour new wine into an old wineskin, you lose the wine and you burst the skin. And I guess this is my argument. This is I'm going to end it here because this is a whole different can of worms. But this is my argument with the people who see Marxism as a fulfillment of liberalism and the Enlightenment. And I've had a lot of those people on my show recently. Whereas I do see us as being birthed from that, but in our recognition of its incompleteness and in our recognition of its historical limitations and in the material reasons why, I think this is often missed in this analysis, we have become something fundamentally different. And our world, if we were going to deliver on the promise of bourgeois revolutions or freedom or whatever, the promise of Hegel, we don't look like what they thought this would look like anymore. And until we accept that, I think, I don't think, when people call this regression or whatever, I think, because you've basically accepted the terms that have degenerated for a variety of reasons.
I mean, it's kind of why when I talk to the Althusserians who have this notion of the theory of historical break and things like that, which is why they reject Bonapartism, their response to my Nietzsche project is often like, well, Nietzsche's a thinker of the 19th century. What are you doing? And I'm like, actually, is the 19th century over? Because that's another dynamic here, right? Which maybe that would be a good question for a video. Like, it's a real debate. And
is the bourgeois century, is just because 100 years passed, did the bourgeois epoch end?
It's a real question. It's a real question,
Right. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And it is something to think about. All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. People should check out Jusant's Vampires. Not easy to spell, but pretty easy to find because there's not many podcasts with that name or anything close to it. They should look at your debate with debate conversation with Catherine Liu was actually really instructive. And weirdly, and I'm not just saying this to be nice, it made me more sympathetic to both of you. Like I actually became, at the end of that, I was like, no, I actually like Catherine more now a little bit, and I like Daniel more. There's other stuff that's been said that I don't think is particularly fair, but the actual debate, I was like,
I certainly walked away liking Catherine a lot more.
I will say, I think when people claim she's a post-leftist, I don't think that's true. Like,
it's too complicated for that.
Yeah,
he is.
I don't think it's that simple. And I also think that's why she's not like editing certain magazines that we're not going to tell us total
right. No, she's a comrade for sure at the end of the day. That's for sure.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much. And people should check that out. And I'll put some links in the show notes. Have a great day, Daniel. I really enjoyed this.
Likewise. All the best, brother.
Bye.